The decanter was heavier than she remembered. Cecily Marsh had served wine at her father's table before the creditors came, before the house was sold, before she had understood that a woman's circumstances could change entirely between one supper and the next, and the world would simply rearrange itself around the fact of her diminishment and not speak of it. She had poured wine in a different life. In that life, the glasses had been her family's. The candles had been paid for, and no one at the table had studied her hands to see whether she held the decanter with appropriate deference. She held it correctly. Now she had learned correctly. The lesson had cost 4 years, and she had paid every penny of it. It was the 4th evening of the Duke of Ashmore's house party, and by the 4th evening, all the hierarchies had settled into their permanent configurations. Lady Penhurst sat at the Duke's right hand, where she had maneuvered herself on the first afternoon, with a precision Cecily could not help but admire even as she observed it from the corridor. Lord Quentin Farr occupied the chair across from the solicitor, Mr. Aldgate, who had arrived without invitation that morning, and whose presence had made Lord Farr's jaw go very still in a way Cecily had noticed, and filed away. The other guests were the ordinary upholstery of such occasions. 2 younger sons angling for the Duke's notice, a pair of sisters whose mother watched the Duke with calculating hopefulness, and the Duke himself, Edmund Ashmore, who sat at the head of the table and said almost nothing, and missed almost nothing, which Cecily had determined was not the same thing as coldness, though the rest of the house party had decided it was. She was not a guest. She had been brought as a companion to Lady Penhurst's elderly aunt, Mrs. Fairfax, who required someone to read aloud to her in the afternoons and to make sure she did not mistake the medicine bottles in the cabinet, and who paid Cecily £17 a year for these services, and was kind about it in the distracted way of women who had never needed to count anything. Cecily was grateful for the kindness. She had learned to be grateful precisely and without excess. She refilled Lord Farr's glass. He did not look at her. To the house party she was simply the companion. Lady Penhurst had referred to her twice as the Marsh girl, Mrs. Barr, Fairfax's creature, once to Lord Farr and once to the elder of the 2 young sons, and both times within a range that suggested Lady Penhurst either did not consider whether Cecily could hear, or had decided that whether she could hear was immaterial. Cecily had heard. She had poured the next glass correctly and moved on. Lord Farr raised his refilled glass and smiled at something Lord Harcastle said, and the candlelight caught the wine in the way that candlelight always did, and Cecily moved to the next place setting and thought about the letter she had found 3 days ago. She had not been looking for it. Mrs. Fairfax had asked her to retrieve a shawl from the blue sitting room on the morning after the guests arrived, and Cecily had gone there and found the door imperfectly latched, and Lord Farr inside with a sheaf of papers, and Mr. Bree, Aldgate's voice on the other side of the wall, muffled but audible through the old plasterwork. And she had stood in the doorway for 4 seconds understanding several things at once. Lord Farr had not seen her. He was bent over the papers with the absorbed private concentration of a man who does not expect to be observed, tracing a line of text with one finger, as though committing it to memory, his lips slightly parted. Cecily had recognized that posture. Her father had worn it when he found an error in a contract. The stillness of a man whose mind was working faster than his hands. She had retrieved the shawl from the arm of the chair closest to the door, moving with the practiced quiet of a woman in service, and she had left the room and pulled the door almost to its original position, and she had walked down the corridor with the shawl over her arm and the understanding cold in her chest. She had said nothing to Mrs. Fairfax. She had gone upstairs and sat on the edge of her narrow bed and thought about what she had understood. Lord Farr was not supposed to be at this house party. He had inserted himself into it through Lady Penhurst, whose attachment to him was of the sympathetic and slightly desperate variety that Cecily had observed before in women of a certain station who were no longer young. He had brought inside a leather case that he kept in his room, documents he had shown to the Duke's steward, with an explanation Cecily had heard, partly through the imperfect plasterwork, and partly through the open window of the study, when she walked below it the following morning. He was representing himself as the agent of a land claim, a disputed boundary on the Ashmore Northern estate, with documentation that placed the decision in his hands. He was misrepresenting himself. The documentation was not what he said it was. Cecily had read law with her father, who had been a solicitor, and she understood what the terms meant and what Lord Ferry was building. She could not prove what she understood. Not yet. She was patient. She had learned patience the way she had learned to hold the decanter, in a school that charged a high fee and gave no certificate. She filled the glass at the foot of the table and returned the decanter to the sideboard and stood in her correct place and watched the room and did not let her face say anything. The Duke of Ashmore looked at her once. Only once, and briefly. His eyes were the gray of river stone, and they held a quality she could not name precisely, a stillness that was not indifference. She had observed this quality several times across the 4 days, and had not permitted herself to attribute meaning to it, because meaning was a luxury her position could not support. She looked at the decanter. She thought about the letter inside Lord Ferry's leather case. She thought of it plainly. There is a correct way to pour wine, and there is a correct way to wait, and she had learned both. If you find yourself holding your breath alongside Cecily, you are exactly where this story needs you. Stay close. The following morning was the kind of English morning that cannot quite decide between autumn and winter. The sky a pale washed gray. The lawns outside the long windows still green but with an edge of frost at the borders. Cecily read aloud to Mrs. Fairfax for an hour, a novel Mrs. Fairfax had already read 3 times and found improved by repetition. And then Mrs. Fairfax dozed over her work, and Cecily set the book down and sat in the window embrasure with a view of the east garden and thought about what she needed and how to get it. What she needed was access to Mr. Chevre Aldgate before Lord Ferry could reach him. Mr. Aldgate had arrived the previous morning from London. He was the Duke's family solicitor, a small grey man of careful habits who had been summoned for reasons that had not been explained at dinner, and Lord Ferry had spent most of the morning in a posture of studied ease that Cecily had recognized as its opposite. The leather case had not left Lord Ferry's room. The documents in it, if they were what she believed, would require Aldgate's confirmation to matter. Ferry needed Aldgate to read and agree and set his seal to something. Ferry had been steering toward that moment since his arrival. He would reach it today or tomorrow. Cecily needed to reach Aldgate first. She had no standing to walk into the study and present her conclusions to a solicitor. She had no standing for most of the things that needed doing. This was not a new condition. She was accustomed to finding the smaller door. The smaller door in this case was Mrs. Fairfax. Mrs. Fairfax, Cecily had learned, had known Mr. Terrius, Aldgate's mother. They were not close acquaintance, but it was the kind of connection that the old do not discard, and Mrs. Fairfax was a woman who liked to renew acquaintance, particularly in the afternoon when the novel's repetitions had given her what she needed for the day, and she wanted something more alive. Cecily suggested that morning that it might be pleasant to ask Mr. Aldgate to take tea. "Yes," said Mrs. Fairfax, waking slightly. "Poor Martin Aldgate's boy. He was a great friend of your grandfather, you know. Or perhaps of mine. One of the two. Shall I send word to him? Do, child, do." Cecily sent word. Then she sat and waited and read 3 more pages of the novel and tried to keep her face from doing anything in particular. Mr. Aldgate came at 3:30. He was even more careful in person than he had seemed across the dining room. A man who sat as though furniture were evidence, and who chose his words the way a man chose his footing on uncertain ground. He drank 2 cups of tea and asked Mrs. Fairfax about her late husband, and described the state of London traffic with the measured despair of a man who had strong feelings about roads. Cecily sat in the corner and was quiet, and poured the 2nd cup, watched the light in the room and listened to the clock. When Mrs. Fairfax drifted into a light doze, Cecily set down the teapot and looked at Mr. Maller. Aldgate said without preamble, "You are here about the Ashmore Northern Boundary Claim." Aldgate looked at her the way people looked at furniture that had unexpectedly spoken. She said, "I believe what Lord Ferry will show you has been altered. I cannot prove it, but I know where to look. I should like 5 minutes of your attention before he reaches you." Aldgate regarded her for a long moment. Then he said, "Miss Marsh, you are Mrs. Fairfax's companion." "I am," she said. "My father was Thomas Marsh. He practiced in Lincoln's Inn until 1812. I read at his side for 6 years before the practice was sold. I understand what an altered instrument looks like, and I understand what this particular alteration is designed to accomplish." Another moment. Aldgate was not a stupid man. He was a man whose world had organized itself around certain expectations about who spoke with authority, in which rooms, and he was recalibrating, visibly, carefully, against what he was hearing. His teacup remained in his hand. He was not going anywhere. 5 minutes, he said at last. She gave him 12, and she was concise and she was correct about everything she said she knew, and honest about everything she could not prove. She told him what she had heard through the plasterwork, what she had inferred from the steward's expression, what she knew from her father's practice about the particular phrase Lord Farrar had used in the study that afternoon. She did not embellish. She did not perform distress. When she was done, Aldgate sat for another moment with his teacup and the expression of a man completing a very long calculation. "The Rushworth deeds," he said. "Do you know where they are held? The estate office. If they have not been moved, I walked past the window twice yesterday afternoon, and the east cabinet was unlocked. It had not been unlocked the day before." Aldgate set down his cup. He said, "You will excuse me, Miss Marsh," in a tone that was not dismissal but departure, the distinction between which Cecily understood well, and she rose and opened the door for him and returned to her corner and picked up the novel. Mrs. Fairfax did not wake until 4:30. Cecily read 3 more pages. She kept her face correct and her hands very still, and tried not to think about what she had just done, which was to trust that it was enough to open a door for a careful man, to hand a thing to someone who could use it, and to step back and wait. She had never been good at waiting. She had learned it. She was learning it still. The dinner that evening was the event toward which the entire house party had been quietly oriented since its beginning. The Duke of Ashmore had arranged a formal supper, not the easy informal dinners of the earlier evenings, but a thing with the full dining room opened, the good china candles in the silver branches that had been in the Ashmore family since the previous century, and a seating arrangement that placed Lord Farrar directly across from the Duke himself. Lady Penhurst was radiant. She had worn sapphires that caught the candlelight, and had laughed more than usual. A bright, practiced laugh that landed just below genuine. Cecily wore her gray silk, which was the best she had, and which was respectable in the way that a clean, mended thing is always respectable. She sat at the far end of the table beside Mrs. Fairfax, who was delighted by the china and had already admired it twice. She did not look at Lord Farrar unless the serving required her direction. She did not look at Mr. Dale. Aldgate, who sat to the left of the Duke and who had been in the estate office for an hour that afternoon, and who had emerged with a particular quality of settled calm that Cecily had recognized immediately and said nothing about. Lord Farrar was confident. She could see it from where she sat, the way confidence sits on a man who believes the ground beneath him is solid. What? He had arrived to this dinner believing the thing was arranged, the document reviewed, the seal as good as set. He had brought the leather case to the dining room, which was unusual, and had left it with the footman by the door, which was the act of a man who meant to retrieve something important on his way out. Soup was served. Fish. The removes arrived. Cecily poured wine when it was needed, and stood in her correct place and thought about nothing and watched everything. It was after the removes were cleared that Lord Farrar set down his fork and looked at the Duke with the expression of a man preparing to close a transaction. He had timed it well. The wine had warmed the table. The conversation had reached a natural pause. The candles were at their best hour. Lady Penhurst's eyes moved to him with something that had hope in it. "Your Grace," said Lord Farrar, and his voice had the easy weight of a man with papers in his favor. "I believe this may be the appropriate moment to speak of the northern boundary question. I understand Aldgate has had the opportunity to review the claim this afternoon." He looked at Aldgate. Aldgate looked at the Duke. The Duke, Edmund Ashmore, set down his own glass with no particular speed. He was a man who had been described at the London season as cold, as formidable, as impenetrable, by people who had mistaken composure for vacancy, and who had never seen his face at a moment when something required his full attention. Cecily had seen it twice that week, once when a horse went lame in the courtyard and the Duke had gone out himself at 7 in the morning, and once over the supper table when a young guest had made a careless remark about the Ashmore tenantry, and the Duke's stillness had become very particular. She recognized it now. "Aldgate," the Duke said. Mr. Aldgate unfolded a paper he had placed, at some point in the proceedings, between his bread plate and his glass. He said in the level voice of a man delivering a thing he has already thought all the way through, "The claim Lord Farrar has presented rests on documents that are not what they represent themselves to be. The instrument is dated 11 years past, purporting to establish a boundary agreement between the Ashmore estate and the late Farrar holdings. It has been altered. The alteration is not skilled." It was caught this afternoon when compared against the estate's Rushworth deeds, which are dated the same year and describe the same boundary in different terms. He did not look at Lord Farrar. The discrepancy is significant. The table went very quiet, the kind of quiet that has a texture that can be felt in the chest. Lady Penhurst's fan stilled. Cecily stood at the sideboard with the decanter in both hands, and kept her face correct and her breathing very deliberate, and watched Lord Farrar's composure dissolve in the particular way that bad men's composure dissolves when they have been outmaneuvered, not with fury, not immediately, but with a momentary blankness. Like a fire that has had all its air taken at once. "The estate's deeds," said Lord Farrar carefully, "were not available to you this afternoon." "They were," said Aldgate. "They had been moved to the East Cabinet." Miss Marsh was good enough to observe, before supper, that the cabinet had been unlocked since yesterday afternoon. "I found the deeds in order." Ferrez's head turned. "He found her?" She held his gaze for exactly as long as courtesy required, and not 1 moment longer. She did not allow her expression to carry anything he could name. "Your Grace," said Lord Farrar, and his voice had changed, the ease gone, something careful and retreating in its place. "I believe there has been a misreading. If I might have another opportunity to present the documentation." "No," said the Duke, one syllable level without cruelty. The word itself a door closed rather than a blow struck. The table understood the word perfectly, and all at once, the way rooms understand things when the person of highest authority in them speaks with simplicity. "Aldgate will retain the documents you have brought," the Duke said, "and refer the matter to the appropriate authority in the morning. Tonight you are my guest, and will be treated as such. I would ask that we speak no further of it at table." He lifted his glass. He said to the table, "To the remainder of the evening." Around the table, glasses were raised and the toast was taken. The 2 younger sons, the sisters, their mother, the old baron at the table's middle who had watched the whole exchange, with the detached attention of a man who had seen other men exposed at tables before, and found the spectacle neither satisfying nor surprising. Even Lady Penhurst, after a fraction of a second that contained a great deal of internal arithmetic, raised her glass. Lord Farrar raised his glass last and drank. Cecily set down the decanter on the sideboard and folded her hands and breathed. She thought of the 4 days. There it was. There was the thing she had been moving toward. He drank his own toast. He sat at the Duke's table, exposed and outmaneuvered, and unable to do anything but drink the wine and smile and absorb the ruin, with whatever composure remained to him, because the Duke had extended exactly that courtesy, and not 1 inch more. She thought her father would have understood this moment very precisely. She did not look triumphant. She was not certain. She felt triumphant. There was something else in her, quieter than triumph, a settling the way a stone settles into the bed of a river, and comes to rest in the shape the water has already made for it. She had not delivered the blow. She had not needed to. She had only held the door open and stood aside, and the rest had been consequence, the slow and implacable consequence of what Lord Farah had himself set in motion, given its proper opportunity to arrive. The dinner continued. Dessert was brought. The conversation found its way back to safer ground, the way it always did, the way a river finds its way around an obstacle, and by the time the port was poured, the younger guests were laughing again at something entirely unrelated to Lord Fair, who sat very still and spoke very little and would be gone. Cecily understood. Before noon the following day. Lady Penhurst did not laugh again that evening. After dinner, while the guests dispersed into the drawing-room, the Duke spoke to Aldgate near the hall door for several minutes, their voices low. Cecily was crossing the hall with Mrs. Fairfax on her arm when he said her name. Miss Marsh. She stopped. Mrs. Marsh. Fairfax, who was tired and had not followed all the table's events with precision, patted Cecily's arm and said vaguely that she would find her way to the drawing-room. She knew the corridor perfectly well and floated away in the direction of the fire. Cecily turned. The Duke had dismissed Aldgate and stood in the hall with the quality of attention she had learned to recognize in him, the quality that meant he was actually looking. He was in full evening dress. The dark coat fitted perfectly to his shoulders, the white cravat exact. And he was not a man who wore his rank the way some men wore it, as a decoration. He wore it the way he wore everything, as though it simply was. He said, "Aldgate tells me you came to him with this information this afternoon." "I observed certain things," she said. "I brought them to the appropriate person." "You had observed them for several days. It was not a question." She answered it anyway. "I needed to understand what I understood before I brought it anywhere, and I had no standing to bring it directly to you." He looked at her for a moment. "You might have tried." "With respect," she said, "I think you know that I could not have, and that bringing it to Mr. Aldgate was the correct door." Something shifted in his face. Not warmth, not yet, but the precursor of warmth, the way the sky changes before the cloud moves. He said, "Your father was Thomas Marsh." She felt the name land, as her name always did now. With a small interior weight, she did not let reach her face. "He was. I knew of him, indirectly. He was a good man, and the matter of his practice was unjust." A pause that held something careful in it. "I should have known who you were before this evening." She said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not cost something. "You will be leaving with Mrs. Fairfax on Saturday," the Duke said. "Yes, Your Grace." He looked at her steadily. He said, "I would prefer that you did not." The hall was very quiet. Behind the drawing-room doors, she could hear the faint sound of voices, and the soft fall of someone at the pianoforte beginning a sonata, the notes careful and measured, and the fire in the hall grate was the only light, and it was warm, and she felt it on her face and her hands. She said, "Your Grace Cecily?" he said. Just that. Her given name, in his voice, a sound so deliberate that she understood immediately it had been chosen and not slipped out, that he had known what it would cost her to hear it, and had said it anyway. She had not heard her given name spoken with that particular weight in 4 years, perhaps longer. Perhaps not ever, not in a voice that had decided something and was telling her so. Her hands, folded in front of her, did not move. And she felt what her hands knew, the steadiness gone briefly liquid, and she let herself know it without letting it reach anything he could see. She said very quietly, "What would you have me do?" "Stay," he said, "as my guest, not Mrs. Fairfax's companion. I will speak to Mrs. Fairfax. I will speak to Aldgate in the morning about the formal arrangements. I am asking you to remain through the week and allow me the opportunity to ask you something properly with the time it deserves." A pause. Small and significant. His eyes holding hers with a steadiness that was itself its own kind of answer. "I have been trying to ask it since the second day." She thought about the second day. She had refilled his glass, and he had said, "Thank you, Miss Marsh," very quietly, and she had thought it was simply courtesy, and had moved on to the next place setting. She had not been wrong that it was courtesy. She had been wrong that it was simply that. She said, "I would not be a guest here, Your Grace. My circumstances are what they are." "Your circumstances," he said, "are that you have done a thing tonight that required intelligence, patience, and courage in equal measure, and that the only person in that dining room who understood the full significance of what Aldgate said was you and I, and that I find I am not prepared to let Saturday arrive without having said that plainly." She looked at him. She permitted herself to look at him fully, which she had not done across the 4 days, which she had been careful not to do. His face in the firelight was what it had always been at the dinner table. Contained, composed, the gray eyes giving nothing away that he had not decided to give. There was something in his expression now that had not been in it across the dining room. A directness that was also a kind of exposure. The look of a man who is decided and is letting the decision be visible. He looked back. He had, she saw, been waiting for this. The particular patience of a man who has decided something and is prepared to hold the decision as long as the decision requires. "The weak," she said at last. Something in his face resolved itself. Not a smile, not quite, but the stillness settling into a different shape. "The weak," he said, "and then we will speak." He offered her his arm. She took it. The pianoforte continued its sonata beyond the drawing-room doors, patient and unhurried, and the fire was warm, and she walked beside him down the hall, thinking about patience and about the way some things accumulate without announcing themselves and then arrive all at once in a quiet corridor. She felt the solidity of his arm beneath her hand, the fine wool of his coat, and she did not try to make her face say, "Nothing. There is no need to manage your face in private," her father had once told her. Save the management for the rooms that require it. This was not one of those rooms. Lord Farr left the following morning, as she had known he would before. 10 o'clock, the leather case still in his possession, except for the documents Aldgate had retained. He said his farewells without bitterness, or at least without visible bitterness, which was the only standard available in this world, and Lady Penhurst watched him go from the morning-room window with a stillness that had grief at its edge. And Cecily did not observe this for longer than courtesy required, and then moved away. By the time the remaining guests sat down to a late breakfast, Lord Farr was simply an empty chair, and the conversation had found other things, and the morning light came through the east windows in long yellow lines across the breakfast cloth, and the Duke of Ashmore sat at the head of the table and said very little and was more present than anyone, which Cecily had understood about him from the beginning. Mrs. Fairfax, when spoken to, was charmed. She could not entirely remember why she was charmed, but she was quite sure she approved, and she told Cecily so twice before luncheon. The Duke, she said, was the image of his grandfather. His grandfather had been a very sensible man. She was pleased, she said, to find sensible men still existed, and she took a small glass of Madeira and was satisfied. The week passed in the way that weeks pass when you are paying close attention to time, which is to say it passed in a series of very specific moments that did not feel like a week at all. Morning walks on the frost-edged grounds, the grass crunching softly underfoot, the bare oaks against the pale sky. Cecily had not walked for pleasure in 4 years. The requirement to be somewhere useful at every hour of the day had become such a thorough habit that the first morning's walk felt slightly transgressive, as though she ought to be accounting for the time to someone. By the third morning she had stopped feeling this and had begun to feel instead the particular quality of cold air on her face, the particular color of the light on the stone walls at 8 o'clock in the morning, the way the grounds went very quiet except for the rooks. The Duke walked with her twice. He was not a man who talked to fill silence, which she had appreciated from the first evening at table, and the walks were easy in the way of things that do not require performance. He asked about her father's practice with the directness of a man who wants to understand rather than console. She answered with equal directness, and did not soften the facts or their consequences, and he listened in the way that careful people listen, without interruption, without the premature sympathy that is itself a kind of dismissal. Afternoons in the library, which was a room Cecily had not been permitted to use as a companion, and was permitted to use now, and which was the kind of room that her father would have stood in for a long moment before touching anything, floor to ceiling, the shelves warm and dense with leather and gilt, a fire in the grate by afternoon, 2 chairs angled toward it. She read for hours on the 3rd afternoon, and heard footsteps in the corridor twice, and knew both times whose they were, and kept her eyes on the page. He had a wound. She understood it by the 3rd day of the week in the way you understand a thing that is shown to you sideways rather than directly. His younger brother had died in the peninsula, a lieutenant of cavalry, 23 years old, in a letter that had arrived to the Duke when he was already Earl and his father 3 months dead. So that he had received the worst news of his life, in a house that already felt like a house in mourning, and had had no one of equal standing to receive it alongside him. The brother's name was Frederick. There was a portrait in the East Gallery, a young man in regimentals with the Duke's gray eyes and a different mouth, a mouth that had more readiness in it than the Duke's, the kind of readiness that does not understand what it does not know. Cecily had found it on a solitary morning walk through the gallery, and had stood before it for a long time. She did not ask him about it. He did not offer. She saw him pass the gallery door on the 4th morning, and slow, almost imperceptibly the way a man slows near a room he has made a habit of not entering. And she understood that grief is a room a person carries, that the room does not diminish with time, that what changes is only whether there is someone who understands what they are walking past. Evenings that were quieter than the early dinners. The house party guests departing 1 or 2 at a time until only the elder Baron remained for 2 nights and then also departed, and the house settled back into something that had room in it. The Duke's small household, the fire and the silence and the meals that were simpler than the formal supper and not less pleasant for that. She had not expected to feel at ease inside a house of this size and quality. She was accustomed to feeling like a needle that has been placed in the wrong drawer, present but not quite in place. This was different, and she would not let herself think too carefully about why. There is a moment in the 5th day of a thing when you stop measuring the days remaining and begin, without quite choosing to, simply inhabiting the thing itself. Cecily noticed this on Thursday morning and said nothing about it. On the 6th day, in the afternoon, he asked her to walk with him on the grounds. The last of the guests had gone that morning, and the house was quiet, with the specific quiet of a large place when only its family remains. Fairfax was dozing by the fire. The gardens were bare and beautiful, the stone walls silver-gray with winter light, the last of the roses cut back to their canes, the hedges trimmed, the paths clear. Their breath made small white clouds in the air, and she could feel the cold at the edges of her shawl where it did not quite reach her elbows. He said as they came to the south garden wall, "I should tell you something. About what I intend to ask you." "Yes," she said. "I am going to ask it formally, and properly, and with Aldgate present if you require it. Because I understand that your situation demands more than an informal conversation, and because I am not a man who makes informal offers of serious things." He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. He turned to face her. The stone wall behind him. The bare rose canes, the winter light on his face showing all the things his face usually withheld. "But before I ask it formally, I should like to tell you that the answer you give will not change what I think of what you did on Tuesday evening, nor what I understand about your character, nor whether I consider myself in your debt. The formal question stands on its own footing. Do you understand me?" she said. "You are telling me that I need not accept in order to be safe." "Yes." She looked at him. She thought about 17 pounds a year, and the narrow bed, and the decanter that was heavier than she remembered, and the way her father had said your inheritance is what is in here, not what is on paper, and had touched his chest. And she thought about the letter that Frederick's death had arrived in, and the specific quality of this man's attention, which was not warmth exactly, but something that had warmth at its source, something that had been waiting for a direction, as a river waits for the moment the ice breaks. She had been patient through harder things than this. She said, "Ask it properly, Your Grace." He did. Simply, directly, in terms that were precise and that meant what they said, his name and his house, and his life, and the desire, stated without ornament, that she share all of these. He asked her to marry him the way he did most things, as though the decision was already settled within himself, and what remained was only to let her know the shape of it. And there was in this no arrogance, but something closer to its opposite, the honesty of a man who no longer sees the point in pretending he has not already made up his mind. There was a particular quality to the light that afternoon, the golden color of English autumn at its very end, the sun already low though it was barely 4 o'clock, and the light came through the bare branches of the oaks at the garden's edge and lay across the stone path in long, thin lines. She stood in it and felt the weight of 4 years of careful competence, of counted pounds and correct deportment, and held breath, settle around the words she gave him in return. Her answer was yes, not giddy, not theatrical, a quiet, considered, specific yes, that meant what it said, and no more, and no less, and which she said, looking directly at him, which she understood as perhaps the most costly and the most freely given thing she had offered in years. He took her hand in both of his. He held it for a moment in the cold air, his gloves and hers between them, and she felt the pressure of his hands and thought, there it is. The thing that does not need to be said aloud, because the saying of it is in every part of this moment, the light and the cold and the stone walls and the rose canes and the bare ground in his hands. They stood in the fading garden light for a moment that Cecily would carry forward with her into the rest of her life, as the moment when the long effort of being invisible to everyone who was supposed to see her came to its quiet, unhurried end. Aldgate was found before supper. The conversation was brief and practical, and concluded with a letter to be dispatched to London in the morning, and with Aldgate's dry assurance that the estate could accommodate the documentation required. Without difficulty, Mrs. Beaupre, Fairfax cried pleasantly, and then fell asleep in her chair. The Duke sat across from her at the supper table and looked, for the first time since Cecily had arrived in this house, like a man inside his own life, rather than administering it from a careful distance. The settlement on Lord Fair's fraudulent claim was resolved in the following weeks, with rather less drama than its discovery had warranted. Farr himself withdrew without contest, which was the sensible course, and which Cecily had predicted to herself with some accuracy. Lady Penhurst wrote a letter to the Duke that was dignified and sad, and which he showed Cecily, asking her opinion, and she said it deserved a kind reply, and he wrote one. By Christmas the great house was different, not in its arrangements, not in its furniture or its order, or the long stone corridors that had always belonged to the Ashmore Dukes. The quality of its quiet had changed, which had a different character now, warmer, inhabited in a new way. A fire in the small sitting room as well as the large. A library shelf moved to accommodate an extra chair. The portrait of Frederick shifted by no explicit discussion to the landing where the morning light reached it, which was better than the gallery, which was a room for looking back. The landing was a room for passing through, and to pass Frederick every morning on the way to the day felt like the right distance, the kind of distance from which the dead can be looked at without flinching. On the first morning of the new year, with snow against the east windows and the grounds white and silent and still, Cecily sat at the library table with a cup of tea going cold, and a letter half-drafted to Mrs. Burnand. Fairfax, who had returned to her own house for the season, and who wrote with a frequency and warmth that suggested she had, after all, understood more of the previous October than anyone had given her credit for. The fire was lit. The chair beside the shelves was the chair that had been moved. The Duke came in with a book, and sat in it and said nothing, which was perfectly sufficient, which was in fact more than sufficient. She finished the letter. She sealed it. She set it aside. He turned a page. The snow went on falling, soft and steady against the window Cecily had now claimed. If Cecily's patience moved you, leave a word in the comments. Thank you for staying until the end.